Hello, I'm going to be reading Caroline, Book 2, Chapter 6, Signal Guns. The next morning, Caroline tiptoed out of her house and closed the door behind her as silently as she could. It was hard to be quiet when she wanted to shout her good news from the rooftop. She hurried to the front gate and looked up and down the lane, hoping to see someone she knew passing by. Since America had gone to war with Great Britain, soldiers and sailors had flooded into the little village of Sackett's Harbor, New York, and the lane was often bustling. Now, though, not a soul was in sight. It's a fine May day, Caroline thought, and I have no one to celebrate with. Just when she was afraid she might burst, she spotted her neighbor coming outside with a market basket over her arm. Caroline slipped out the gate and raced after the plump woman. "Mrs. Shaw!" she cried. "Mrs. Shaw!" Mrs. Shaw turned and waited for Caroline to join her. "Gracious, Caroline," Mrs. Shaw said sternly, "it isn't seemingly for young ladies to race about." "Papa is home!" Caroline cried. She was ready to take her neighbor's arm and dance a jig. Mrs. Shaw stared at her with wide eyes. "Heaven be praised," she whispered. "Did the British release him after all this time?" "No, he escaped." Caroline bounced on her toes. "He got away last autumn, but he broke his leg in the wilderness and couldn't travel all winter. He's been making his way here since spring came. I found him at his old fish camp, and I helped him walk home last night." Mrs. Shaw gave Caroline a quick hug. "Is he well?" "He hasn't had enough to eat," Caroline told her, "and he needs to rest. He's sleeping now." Grandmother had sent Caroline outside to make sure that Papa could continue sleeping. Actually, but Caroline didn't think Mrs. Shaw needed to know that. Mrs. Shaw pulled out a handkerchief and wiped tears from her eyes. "I had given up hope," she admitted. "I never did," Caroline said stoutly. It had been terribly hard to wait and wonder for so many months, but she had never lost hope. "Well," Mrs. Shaw said, "you tell your father that I will bake a pie to welcome him home." Caroline grinned. "I'll tell him," she promised. Once Mrs. Shaw was on her way, Caroline tried to use up some of her bubbling energy by hoeing weeds in the garden. She and Grandmother had planted seeds earlier in the spring, and now tidy rows of tiny green seedlings marched across the soil. "Papa will eat some of those carrots and those peas," Caroline thought happily. It felt like a miracle to have him home. Hours seemed to pass before the kitchen door opened and Mamma stepped outside. Caroline dropped the hoe and darted over to join her. "Is Papa awake?" she asked. Mamma smiled. "He is. After a good meal and a hot bath last night, he slept soundly. He's already looking much better. He's coming downstairs for breakfast." Caroline bounced on her toes again. "May I sit with him?" "Garden chores can wait," Mamma agreed. She smiled and kissed the top of Caroline's head. "Let's go inside." Caroline, Mamma, Grandmother, and Papa lingered at the kitchen table as he ate breakfast. Caroline was grateful that Mrs. Hathaway and her daughters had kindly gone out to visit friends. "Your family needs a bit of privacy," Mrs. Hathaway had said. Caroline sat on the bench next to Papa. "He's home," she thought over and over. "Papa is home. It does me more good than I can say to find my family well," Papa said. He finished a second biscuit. "But I've been afraid to ask, what has happened to the shipyard?" Abbott's shipyard is doing a brisk business, Mama told him. It is? Papa blinked, as if it was far better news than he'd expected. I feared that once the war began, no one would order any new ships. I imagined I would find the shipyard closed and silent, and all the workers gone. Grandmother chuckled. You have a pleasant surprise waiting. You'll be proud of the men when you see everything they've done, Caroline promised him. Papa smiled at her and stroked her hair. No doubt you're right, Caroline, he said. I am eager to inspect the yard. He folded his napkin and put it inside. We'll go at once. Mamma looked concerned. Perhaps that should wait. Don't you want a few more days of rest? No, indeed, Papa said. I've spent almost a year wondering how my business has been faring, and I already feel like a new man. I'll come too, Caroline exclaimed. Once Caroline and Mamma had fetched their shawls, the family set out, with Caroline on one arm and Mamma on the other. Papa does look like a new man, Caroline thought, remembering how ragged he had looked when she'd found him at the fish camp. He still limped, and she realized sadly that he probably always would. But he had shaved, and Mamma had cut his hair. His clothes looked big on his thin frame, but they were clean and free of holes. I hardly recognize our little village, Papa said, taking in the merchants' tents and hastily built taverns that had sprouted to serve all the soldiers, sailors, and shipbuilders who had arrived during his absence. The harbor came into view. Papa stopped walking and stared in astonishment. Caroline tried to see the scene through Papa's eyes. Many things had changed while he was away. Each end of the harbor was now protected by a small log fort, with American flags proudly flying. She pointed to a narrow spit of land that stretched out into the harbor. We call that Navy Point now. See all those wooden buildings? Those are for military men and their supplies. So many soldiers and sailors are here now, Papa marveled. Hundreds and hundreds, Caroline told him. But a lot of them, like Lieutenant Hathaway, are away right now. They sailed off to Upper Canada more than a month ago to capture some forts. She tried to hide a shiver. She didn't like having so many sailors and soldiers gone. What if the British attacked? Papa didn't seem to notice her unease, and it seems that Abbott's is no longer the only shipyard in Sackett's Harbor, he said. He stared at a new shipyard next to his own. It was much bigger than Abbott's and bustling with activity. The Navy has established its own yard, Mama told him. There are hundreds of shipwrights and carpenters in the village now. Papa stared with admiration at a huge ship under construction in the Navy Yard. Caroline told him that frigate will be the mightiest ship ever to sail the Great Lakes. It's going to have 28 cannons. Well, that should give the British trouble, Papa said, rubbing his jaw. Our shipyard is giving the British trouble too, Caroline told him proudly. We're not making merchant sloops or schooners anymore. We're building gunboats for the Navy. Papa shook his head as if trying to take in all the changes. This is a much better homecoming than I could have imagined, he said. Caroline slipped her arm through his. Let's go see the men, she said. They'll have a lot to show you. The workmen at Abbott's were overjoyed to see Papa. Caroline laughed when they whooped and cheered and tossed their hats into the air. How joyful it must be for Papa, she thought, to find his workers still here. Mr. Tate pumped Papa's hand. I always knew you'd come home, sir, he declared. Indeed I did. His eyes sparkled with unshed tears. For a moment, Papa seemed unable to find words. He clenched Mr. Tate's hand. Caroline could see that her father was overwhelmed with emotion. Finally, Papa cleared his throat. I'm very glad to be here, he said in a husky voice. Now I'd like to inspect the yard. Mr. Tate showed him the gunboat the men were building. He explained everything they had learned as they switched from making trading ships to constructing heavy military boats. Caroline saw the workers listening carefully, as if hoping that Papa would approve of everything that had been done in his absence. When the tour was complete, Papa declared, "I am more proud of you all than I can say. I spent months fearing that Abbott Shipyard was no more. Instead, you've been helping to defend our country from our enemy." The men grinned and elbowed each other. Caroline was proud of them too. She knew how hard they'd worked. She'd watched them. Then Papa went to the office and Mama showed him how she'd kept the books. "You managed all this?" Papa asked. "Mama took charge right away," Caroline told him. "She's handled the contracts and made sure the men had the supplies they needed." Papa looked startled. "I see," he said. "I had a lot of help," Mama explained. "Mr. Tate watched over the workers, and Caroline helped me watch over the business accounts." "Caroline?" Papa sounded taken aback, and he looked at her with an expression she didn't recognize. "My little girl helping with the accounts?" "I just tried to be helpful," Caroline said quickly. "I made copies of letters that Mama needed to send and checked the sums in the ledgers." She knew that Mama had given her those tasks largely so that Caroline could practice her penmanship and arithmetic. Even so, she'd taken pride in her work. She watched Papa, anxious to know that he was proud of her and Mama too. "I see that I have much to learn," Papa said quietly. He didn't look at Caroline, but instead settled on the high stool in the front of his desk. He opened a ledger and began looking through the records. "Caroline, perhaps you and I should take a stroll down to the dock," Mama said. "It's such a fine day." Caroline followed Mama outside. "Is something wrong?" she asked as she and Mama walked away from the office. "Is Papa displeased?" "Not at all," Mama assured her. "You and I must try to remember that for all these months, Papa feared for his business would fail without him. He didn't expect to find Abbott's shipyard busier than ever." Caroline was still confused. "But that's good news. I thought he would be happy." "He will be," Mama said. "But we must give Papa time to learn about all the changes that have taken place while he was away. Can you be patient with him?" "Of course," Caroline said firmly. She would do anything she could to help Papa. The next morning, Caroline came downstairs at dawn and found Grandmother and Mrs. Hathaway making breakfast. The bacon, sizzling over the fire, smelled so good that Caroline's stomach growled. "Please set the dining room table," Grandmother told Caroline. "Now that your father is home, we've too many people to sit here in the kitchen." Once everyone had gathered around the table, Caroline introduced the boarders. "Papa, this is Mrs. Hathaway and Rhonda and Amelia," she beamed. For many months, the Hathaways had heard stories about Papa. Now they could meet him in person. Little Amelia was very quiet, sucking her thumb and watching him closely. Rhonda seemed unusually shy as well. "A pleasure to meet you, sir," she said. After a quick nod, she looked down at her plate. Caroline nudged Rhonda under the table with her knee. Usually that would make Rhonda giggle and nudge back even harder. Today, though, Rhonda didn't respond. Caroline was puzzled by her friend's mood. Suddenly, Caroline realized why Rhonda was being quiet. "Everything's turned upside down," Caroline thought. "I used to envy Rhonda because her father was nearby." Now Papa was home and Rhonda's father was off on a dangerous expedition. Caroline leaned close enough to whisper in her friend's ear, "Your father will be here soon," and boom, boom! Caroline looked up sharply and clapped her hands over her ears as cannon fire shuddered through the air. The window panes rattled, and it felt as if her bones rattled too. Papa dropped his fork with a clatter. Mamma's face went white. Not today, Caroline thought. She felt numb with disbelief. Those shots came from the big guns at the fort, she said. Sackett's Harbor must be under attack. Hands curled into fists. His face settled in hard lines. Caroline jumped to her feet. She ran from the dining room and out the front door. She had to find out what was happening. Her family and the Hathaways joined her just as a young man on horseback clattered toward them. Papa stepped to the gate and waved a hand. Sir, he barked in a ship captain voice, what's happening? The young man pulled his horse to a stop. A British fleet has been sighted about 7 miles from here, he told them, breathing hard. I'm with the militia, on my way to spread the word. How large is the fleet? Papa demanded. There are probably 1,000 enemy men out there, the militiaman said, and when they land, they'll have their ship's cannons to protect them. 1,000 men? Caroline felt anger boil up inside. Hateful British. I wish they would just leave us alone. Papa squinted the way he sometimes did when he was sailing a ship and making a judgment about the weather. There's no wind, he said. Aye, the soldier agreed. Those ships can't move with no wind in their sails. That gives us some time to call in the militia. Now I must be off. He kicked his horse to a gallop, and everyone watched him pound away. Mamma murmured, Thank heavens the British weren't able to surprise our men. But the wind could start blowing again any moment, Caroline said. It could. Papa nodded. The wind could pick up again an hour from now or a day from now. We must use whatever time we have to prepare for the attack. Grandmother leaned on her cane with both hands. We've known this would come sooner or later, she said. They're after that big new frigate the Navy's building. I'd wager. But most of our soldiers and sailors are away, Rhonda cried. There's hardly anyone left to defend us. Those alarm guns were meant to call out the militia, Grandmother reminded Rhonda. And riders like that young man will be on their way to distant farms where the men might not hear the guns. Our militia men will be ready to meet the British. Caroline understood why Rhonda sounded so frightened. She was frightened too. She had seen the militia drilling in town, practicing for a battle. The farmers and workmen were not nearly as well trained as the Army and Navy men. Another deafening boom, boom sounded as the signal guns repeated their message. Come, girls, Mrs. Hathaway said quietly to Rhonda and Amelia. She shepherded her daughters back inside. Caroline glanced at Papa. He looked grim. What a terrible homecoming, Caroline thought. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Papa turned to his wife. I must go. What? Mama gasped. Go where? Caroline asked at the same time. Papa said, to volunteer with the militia. Papa, no! Caroline cried. How could he leave? She'd just gotten him back. Mama clutched his arm. You're not well. You're not yet well. I'm well enough, Papa said. I can handle a musket. Sackett's Harbor needs every man to fight. Caroline grabbed Papa's free hand. If I never let go, she thought, maybe Papa won't leave. She watched her parents anxiously. I don't want to go, Papa said to them, but I think you understand why I must. But you've just got home, Caroline protested. It's not fair. It isn't fair, Papa agreed. He squeezed her hand. But life is not always fair, especially in times of war. Mama still looked worried, but she nodded. Very well, she said. You join the militia and defend the village. But the gunboat and our shipbuilding supplies must be protected as well. I'll keep watch of the shipyard. Papa shook his head. You will not. Mr. Tate and the men will defend this shipyard. You and your mother and Caroline must take shelter in the root cellar. He put one arm around Caroline's shoulder. She burrowed closer, wishing she could stay beside him forever. Papa added, I don't want to join the militia without knowing that all of you are safely away from the fighting. He sounded so worried that Caroline knew she had to help ease his mind. We'll stay safe, she promised, but it was hard to squeeze the words around the lump in her throat. And that's the end of the chapter.